Hey, what's going on, roleplayers? This is the Bard here, and welcome back to the corner. So today we've got a request regarding game mechanics. Could you do an explanation on ritual casting? It's the one big mechanic I've never gotten my head around. No problem, buddy, I will sort you out. Rituals were the one big improvement that I always wanted in D&D. It was the one thing that basically they needed to put in, because if you had the book in front of you, why couldn't you just cast the spell by reading it from the book? So rituals was one of the best inclusions in my opinion. There's actually very little to say about rituals. There's a very small part about them on page 201 and 202. So what we'll do is we'll just go through it point by point, and then we'll go over some of the things you can do with rituals, and the probably most complicated part, which is just who exactly can cast a ritual and how, and that should pretty much cover everything you need. So first and foremost, which spells are rituals and which ones aren't. Underneath the spell name there is the spell level and the school of magic that it comes from, and next to it, in brackets, it might say ritual. If it says ritual, then it's a ritual spell. Ritual spells aren't really separate from normal spells. You can still use a spell slot and cast them with the same casting time that it says in its description. However, if you want to cast it as a ritual instead, it does not require you to use your spell slot, but it does require you to add an additional 10 minutes to the casting time. Simply put, if you cast the spell using a spell slot, you just do what it says in the description. If you want to cast it as a ritual, then you just add 10 minutes to the casting time and you don't use up any spell slots. So it's as simple as that. As you're no doubt aware, many spells get additional effects the higher level slot you use. But because you're not using any slots, with the ritual casting, you have to use it at its base level. So if there are additional bonuses you get for casting in high level slots, you'll never be able to get those when using rituals. Whatever the basic description says, that is what you use, and that is what you will always have whenever you cast a spell as a ritual. There might be some small way around that though. I mean, if you were a sorcerer with the ritual caster feat, you might be able to use your meta magic in order to get an additional effect, like double duration for example. Because you're using sorcery points and they're not affecting slots, they just have a mechanical effect that adds to a spell. And there's no distinction in the actual ritual caster paragraph either, so it could be a small way around that just to make a small improvement on ritual castings, but other than that, that's the only thing I can think of, and I don't even know if it works. But considering the fact that the sorcerer would need to take the ritual caster feat in order to be able to cast rituals in the first place, I see it as a bit of a fair trade-off. And if I had to call it, I would say okay, because let's be honest, you're not going to be using meta magic with your rituals that much anyway, so I wouldn't see it as a big issue. Either way, if that's too confusing or your DM says no, or whatever the reason, if it just seems too complicated, then just ignore it and use rituals as stated in the spell description. Whether that last example works or it doesn't work is a moot point, but why I bring it up is because you'll probably noticed I used the terms if the sorcerer has the ritual caster feat, because not all casters are ritual casters. So obviously sorcerers are not ritual casters. Warlocks are not ritual casters. Only under specific conditions can they become ritual casters. So either by taking the ritual caster feat, or in the instance of the warlock, if they have the Book of Shadows, then they can potentially become ritual casters as well. When it comes to your class, look at the spell casting section. If there is a section on your class that has spell casting, it will usually say things like cantrips, spellbook, preparing and casting spell, spellcasting ability, that kind of thing. If there is a section underneath that says ritual casting, then you know that you can cast rituals, but it's different for every kind of class. So a bard, for example, is a ritual caster. It has it in the spellcasting description, and you can cast any bard spell you know as a ritual if that spell has the ritual tag. So you need to have it in your spells known, otherwise you can't use the ritual. Or in the case of the ritual caster feat, have it in your ritual spellbook, but we're going to ignore that for the moment and just concentrate on the spell casting. So spontaneous casters are probably the easiest casters for rituals. In the case of the bard, you just need to know the spell, and as long as you know it, you can cast it as a ritual, if it has the ritual tag. Easy enough. Classes that prepare spells, like cleric and druid for example, can still use the ritual caster as well, because as long as it's in your prepared spell list, you can cast any spell that's prepared already as a ritual spell. Wizards make some of the best ritual casters, because even though they prepare their spells ahead of time, they don't have to have the ritual spell prepared. As long as they have their spellbook in front of them, they can cast the spell as a ritual. These are the prime examples of how rituals work for varying character classes, and it's all explained within each individual class description. So if you have any problems with it, you should just be able to go to the ritual casting section for your character class and just look it up there. Sometimes it's just easier to visualize how the spell works in order to get a grasp on how ritual magic and regular magic work in conjunction with each other. So I'm going to use an old example from previous editions, which might help to give some clarity to it. So here's a visual component that you can use just to help you understand how rituals and slots might work. Even though it doesn't actually work like this in 5th edition, the principle is still there, and it can basically give you a good representation of how a spell could function. So in previous editions, what a wizard would do would be to pre-cast the spells per day that he was going to use. So where it says slot, you'll notice that there's a large rectangle and then a small rectangle after the break. And that's the important bit, the break point. So what used to happen, there would be a casting of however long the spell would take to cast, and then right at the very end of the spell there'd be a break point, and at that break point the spell was already primed, and then it's just the last few components that you need in order to bring the spell into effect. And that's why it would cost you only one action to do a spell, as opposed to casting something over, say, 10 minutes. If you want to translate this over to 5th edition, it's really quite simple. Just look at where it says ritual. The casting starts and then it continues on until it's complete, and therefore you have your 10-minute ritual casting as described on page 201 and 202. When it comes to prepared spells, you have where it says slot, and those are basically pre-cast spells that are primed and ready to use, and then you just have that last little action that you need in order to complete the spell. So if you look at it from this perspective, you then basically have a ritual casting, which is just a casting from start to finish, and then you have slot-based casting, which you could perceive as already prepared spells, because they're prepared and pre-primed, and then you just need an action in order to finish the casting. All ritual casting is basically the spell which is going from start to finish without interruption. Rituals, I think, are going to be a really important part of the game, because even though it takes an additional 10 minutes in order to do something, it actually saves you more time than it uses, because you're not having to then rest and then change your spell slots and then get new ones in order to use them. You can just use the spells that you have. There are some absolutely amazing spells, and in some really low levels as well. Spells like Alarm and Unseen Servant are just amazing to use as rituals. Alarm is brilliant because if you just put it at the beginning of the dungeon or wherever, or if you put it in a crossroads or some kind of junction in a dungeon, then you just spend 10 minutes casting Alarm, you place it down, you move on, you forget about it. If your alarm pings for any reason, you know that something is moving around in that junction or has perhaps entered or exited the dungeon itself. So again, it's just a really useful function to have. Normally you wouldn't have a spell prepared for that purpose, because it's kind of a waste of a spell slot, but if you can just do it as a ritual, then it's much more valuable in that respect. Spells like Unseen Servant are also really good choices for rituals, because you don't want to load up on Unseen Servant spells. So if you could cast it as a ritual and then have it push, say, a large crate or something down what you think might be a potentially trap-filled corridor, if there are any pressure plates that it could react to, then of course it would set off those traps. But you want to be a problem-solving wizard, but you also want to be in combat as well, so you want to be useful in as many situations. So being able to use your ritual to cast something like Unseen Servant in the previous example is great, as well as still being able to use your spell slots for other things. Magic Mouth is a great example of a spell that you would just set up and leave, so it's not one that you would have memorized unless you knew specifically ahead of time what it is you wanted, but perhaps if you were in a place and you needed to leave a message for someone, when they come and they meet the triggering conditions, it plays the message for them and then the thing dispels. So if you know you need it, but you don't know ahead of time that you're going to need it, it's great for being able to cast it as a ritual. One of the best examples of a ritual is Leomund's Tiny Hut. It basically gives you some fortification against creatures, it gives you protection against the elements, it's warm, it's comfortable. You can see out, but no one can see in. It's an amazing spell, but you don't want to have it in your spell slots. You want your spell slots for other things. So at the end of your adventuring day, once your spell slots are used up, open up your ritual book and then start casting the spell, and then you're refreshed and comfortable for the day ahead. And that's the other thing about rituals. It doesn't matter if you've run out of spell slots per day, because you don't use them. So even if you're completely wiped out of spells and you can't cast anything, you can still cast your rituals and you can still be of some value to the rest of your party. Rituals aren't difficult to understand, but no one can understand all the rules all the time, so it's a perfectly legitimate request. Perhaps you know about rituals, but you just don't use them. Hopefully you guys understand the value of rituals and you're going to use them much more often. They are so good because you're not using up any of your resources. There are a few examples like Magic Mouth that do require some monetary expenditure, but it's just worth having that ability just to be able to do it when you need it. So I would say make full use of rituals as often as you can and just save on your resources, because you never know when something nasty is going to walk around the corner. Are you guys using rituals to full effect? Let me know in the comments down below. Also be sure to like and subscribe, and I will see you guys next time at the gaming table.